Morning, Damien. Morning, Ashley. Morning, Alex.
Morning, all.
We'll just give it another 30 seconds or so for people to get logged on, and then we'll get started.
Damien said, morning, I actually answered you verbally.
Damien, what part of the world are you in today? Are you in Ireland or are you in England? Ireland. What's it like over there? Good weather? Are they strict with lockdown? Tropical. Love it. Not bad, actually. Oh, that's good. Hope it's nice where you are, Ashley, as well. London's beautiful today. Okay, all right. I think it's kind of stopped creeping, so maybe we should start there. So welcome, guys. Never dull in Hull. Sorry, I've just seen that, Ashley. Glad it's nice there. Welcome, guys, to today's session on the importance of self-awareness in business. We are joined by Chris Hatfield, who's our Sales Enablement Manager today, and he's going to take us through this session. This one is focused more on the leadership part, so some of you might have seen this in the Mind Couch series, but Chris is actually going to go through kind of how to promote that self-awareness within your team as well, so looking at it from a leadership aspect as well. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Chris to get started.
Thanks, Sheila. Morning, everyone. Good to see you, or not see me. Yeah, so some of you might have tuned in to last week's session. If you did, that's absolutely fine. As Sheila mentioned, I'm going to be going through a bit more around how you can start doing this and spotting this within your teams as well and supporting them. So the topic today is the importance of self-awareness in business. And what I'm going to be talking you through is a bit more about what it means to be self-aware, why it's important, and three key areas that you and also your team can develop and become more mindful of in any part of your role. This isn't just for salespeople. This is for anyone within the business. And the feedback we got last week from a variety of teams is that it really benefited them. So hopefully it can do the same for yourself and your team. So let's start things off. There we go. So self-awareness, in a nutshell, it's your story versus your reality. So what's going on in your mind? How relevant is that to what's going on around you? If, for example, you've got this vision in your head that everything is going well, or everything is terrible, but on the flip side, it's the complete opposite around you, that would mean you've got a lack of self-awareness. A real heightened self-awareness means that you're very aware of what's going on and you're able to deal with it in the right way, relevant to what's happening in the present moment. And there's three key areas that kind of impact our self-awareness: our thoughts and beliefs, our emotions, and our habits and behaviors. Our thoughts and beliefs affect our emotions. So our thoughts affect how we feel, and how we feel affects how we act, and how we act affects how we think. So they're all interlinked here. So what I'm going to talk you through is coming at it from a place where someone might be a bit unaware or lack of self-awareness, which you might be able to spot within your teams or even yourself, and then how you can encourage it, and also what you might start to look to do to develop that to help them become more self-aware. So I thought I'd share this quote with you to start off. One of my favorites when I talk around this topic: your relationship with yourself sets the tone for every other relationship you have. And, we often talk about building a strong culture in the business, building a strong team, understanding our customers more effectively. But if we don't understand ourselves and have a strong relationship with ourselves, then we're not going to be doing anyone around us a full service from that. So let's get into thoughts and beliefs. And we'll start with a story. And I think this is a really I love using analogies and stories, and I think it's a very powerful way if you are engaging with your teams to deliver messages in a way that simplifies it, but also anchors it and gives them something to remember it by. So this story is of a man walking past a field, and he sees these elephants, these giant elephants, fully grown, just standing there. And he thinks, why aren't they running away? And on closer inspection, he sees that they've got a peg with a bit of rope wrapped around their ankle. And he thinks, that's tiny. Like, why are these elephants just standing there? Surely they could pull that up and go. So he keeps walking, and he goes past a person who's there, and he says, do you know why they're not running? And he says, well, when the elephants are young, what we do is we get the same peg and the same bit of rope, and we put it in the ground. And the elephant tries to pull away and tries to pull away, but at that age and that size doesn't have the strength. So they give up, and over time they just stop pulling and pulling, to the point now we can just leave it on them and they think they can't break free from it. And this is very much aligned to how we can sometimes believe things and think things that aren't true. We've maybe tried things once or twice or never at all, and we've had this limiting belief that we just can't quite do it, so we give up. And you might be able to spot this within your teams when certain things come up in monthly reviews or certain projects where people are just saying things. And I'll give you some examples of some of these statements. I'm not good with, I'd never be able to, I won't, I can't, I'll always be, I don't think, that won't work. Spotting these kind of things, and they can be throwaway comments, but it might be even in the meeting before you've even started on the project or you've given them a task, is catching that and helping them reframe that. Because if that isn't reframed, then they're going into it set up for failure or not for the amount of success that they could achieve. So when we look at it from this angle, these beliefs are very much limited and non-serving. They're not going to benefit them. No one is going to do themselves any favors thinking this. And as I mentioned, we see these as unquestionable facts. They're statements that we put into our heads. The analogy I use is that our brains are a bit like a Google search engine. So anything we type in, they're going to come back with. And if all we're typing in is statements, all they're going to come back with is evidence to prove as to why this is true. So really think about this when you're speaking to your teams in meetings, when you're giving them tasks to do, when they're coming back and telling you about things they're working on or situations or calls they've had. Is there any limiting beliefs around that? Is there anything that's stopping them from really believing they can achieve success? And if there is, how can you start to reframe that? And that's what we'll look to do now. So from a self-aware perspective, now some of you might be familiar with this analogy here if you've used the Headspace app. Our thoughts and beliefs are very much like traffic in that they come and go. They come into our mind. We can't control them, but we can control what we do with them and how we react to them. And if we're coming from a place of self-awareness, we can imagine that the traffic is there and we're sitting on the side of a motorway and we're just watching all our thoughts go by. If we were coming from a place of lack of awareness, we would be in the middle of the motorway and all the traffic's coming towards us. So every time a thought comes into our head, we panic and we think, oh my God, like, what do I do? What do I do? Whereas it's just a thought. Everyone has the same thoughts. It just depends on how you react to it. So one of the big things here with your teams, if they are bringing up statements and limiting beliefs, is encouraging them to ask themselves questions and you asking them questions as well. Again, using the Google search engine analogy, if you're putting in a statement, it will come back with the evidence. If you're putting in a question, it will come back with solutions. It will come back with ways around it. So think about this when people are coming to you with a limiting belief, is encouraging them and asking them, well, what's the question from this? So I can't do that is, well, the question would be, how can I become more confident in doing this? Or that won't work, or what can I do to make it work? Encouraging these types of things and not just disagreeing with them and saying, oh, it will, no, you're wrong. That's not going to help because it's a limiting belief. You need to address it. So encouraging them and you asking them and getting into the habit of, if you do, once you've done this for a while and someone gives you a statement, is going, well, what's the question? You know, what's the solution around this rather than the problem? And linked to this as well is this idea of perfection, of when we do something, whatever we want to do, whether it's work or in life, we want to do it perfectly. And we're, you know, as people, whenever we do something, we want to go 100 miles an hour at it, and sometimes just think we can never quite do it. And it's often because we've had this idea of perfection in our minds. And the problem with perfection is that there's no tangible way to measure it. There's no tangible end goal. If you ask someone who says it needs to be perfect, what it looks like, they can't quite describe it, and neither can we, because it doesn't exist. Perfection is also based on other people's opinions, which isn't really relevant. So what we need to start doing, and whether this is yourself or your teams, is to start thinking, what would I do to be satisfied with it rather than perfect? And as leaders and managers, a good thing for you to start doing is agreeing those mutual levels of satisfaction. So whether it's on the project, whether it's how much work they're going to be able to do today, whether it's their tasks for the week, agreeing what would you do to be satisfied, and asking them this, asking the question, what would you do to be satisfied with it? Because if you've got someone in your team who's constantly never quite happy with things and always sort of beating themselves up a bit sometimes because they can never quite do it, it's probably because they've got this idea of perfection. But the thing about satisfaction is that it's something you can measure. It's something that can grow as you grow over time. So your levels of satisfaction in your teams can grow as their experience grows. And also satisfaction is based on their own and yours opinion rather than anyone else's. It's a bit more clearer to understand. So again, those two things there, encouraging them to ask questions to themselves and also for you to do it, and also agreeing those mutual levels of satisfaction when you are working on things of what the kind of minimum expectations are, what they need to get done, versus giving them a task and them thinking walking away that it needs to be done by the end of the week. If it doesn't, what's the minimum that needs to be done by that? If it does, then fine. Of course, we've got tight deadlines sometimes, but if it isn't, it's always agreeing that mutual level with them. So how does this benefit you and your team? It increases the confidence, the self-belief and empowerment. If your teams are starting to think like this, it removes those blockers in their minds. And also for you as a team, you can become more effective, clearing the headspace to maintain momentum. The alignment on expectations and projects, you're more likely to hit deadlines because you haven't got these limiting beliefs that can sometimes not just be and this is a good point to make actually, it's not just sometimes people have limiting beliefs in themselves, they can have limiting beliefs of others. And we can sometimes be guilty of this as managers and leaders, is having limiting beliefs of other people, sometimes in our team or other teams. So it's important to start thinking about this yourself as well when you are working with your team or other departments or other people, is do I have any limiting beliefs around this? Because if I do, as the old Henry Ford quote goes, whether I believe I can or I can't, I'm always right, I'm going to look for that to be true. So really spend some time thinking about that. And if you do, that's okay, but it's about shifting that and thinking, okay, how do I ask myself questions rather than just go in and have these limiting beliefs of this person? So the next one is emotions. Now, some of you who might not have been on furlough might have felt like this over the last, even people who've been on furlough probably felt like this as well from a different angle of what's been going on over the last sort of few months. So coming from a place of lack of awareness, we often see emotions there to sabotage us. We see anything that isn't happy or excited as a negative emotion. We see anxiety as a negative emotion. We see stress. We see all these things. And what we do a lot of the time, and what your team do, is they ignore them or they suppress them or just accept them. You might have people in your team, or you might have been said this yourself, my job's just stressful, or stress is part of the job. Doesn't have to be. And the thing here is as well, if people start ignoring them and suppressing them, it's just going to build up and it's going to come out in another way, of course, whether it's someone being ill from it or someone deciding, actually, do you know what, the role's not for me. So it's really important here that, and I'll go on to it shortly, that we start to kind of have those conversations to make people feel a bit more comfortable with voicing their concerns. When we come from a place of lack of awareness for our emotions as well, we're operating in a place of fear. We're going into every situation thinking the worst and thinking something's going to happen, and therefore we're in a constant state of anxiety, stress and fear because we just have that reaction in our body. And what happens in our body, there's something called the amygdala within our brain that's like the alarm system. And if that's constantly going off, it's like imagining a smoke alarm going off in a house constantly. You can't turn it off. You're going to be on edge. It's going to rile you up. And the challenge with this is as well, often within your emotions, if you aren't self-aware of them, is that a lot of the time you're thinking about things that have happened or are going to happen. They're not actually happening to you right now. our minds can play tricks on us, and we could be thinking about a meeting or a project or something that we did last week or a conversation that we had 1 or 2 weeks ago that's actually impacting us now. Or we could think about a meeting or a deadline or a project coming up that's going to impact us. So with this, even though the current present situation right now is fine, our minds are drifting away and creating problems that haven't even occurred yet, because we're not self-aware of what's actually happening, and it's tricking our minds and our emotions into thinking something else. So what does it look like coming from a place of self-awareness? And I'd encourage you to speak to your teams about this. And, there was the webinar last week, if you want to share that with them. But emotions are neutral. They're there to serve us, not sabotage us. It's our perception of our emotions that puts them either to a positive or negative. So if you take, for example, stress is a classic example. When we're stressed, we release a number of different hormones, one of which actually makes us more social, one of which actually makes us reach out, which is why sometimes when we react vocally, it's because we want support of other people. But what stress actually does as well is it releases a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol comes into our body, and within 90 seconds, it's designed to bring our body back to a natural state so that we can just carry on with our day. But the problem is we often live in that moment because we voice it. We tell everyone else about it. We say, I'm just stressed. I'm having a stressful week. It's going to be a stressful day. It's not going to be a good day today. And we immerse ourselves in it so that even though our body's gotten over it, we're living on with it in our minds. So I'd really encourage you, when you do have people in your team that either you spot are getting stressed or having a challenging time, and I know it's a bit more challenging at the moment because we're all working from home, but if you've had a video call with them or a phone call, is just encourage them in that moment just to take like a couple of minutes and just to sort of, step back from what they're working on, or whether that's a conversation with you or one of the team or someone else, and just ask them, just go and have a breather, go out for a walk for 5 minutes, just get some fresh air, do something, play your guitar, whatever you want to do. Get them to kind of shift that, because that's important with this as well, is not getting immersed in it. The self-aware aspect of it is as well is that we can start to become more aware of what's actually happening in the present. We're not drifted too far from the past or the future. And this is a good conversation to have with your teams, is when they are bringing things up, is going, well, that hasn't happened yet. That's 2 or 3 weeks from now. So let's just focus on the present. What can you do right now? Or 1 or 2 weeks ago, something happened, is, well, you can't change that. So what can we do? It's always about bringing it back to, how do we move forwards? How do we move forwards from what's going on right now? Like moving a solution-based conversation rather than a problem one. And a big thing around this is modeling behavior. And, this is talked around a lot with children, but I think it applies so much with adults, particularly leaders, is how we act is very relevant to how other people are going to act and behave. So if we are someone that gets stressed, and when we do, where it's very visible for our team and it's sometimes taken out on them, or they'll immerse themselves in that and they'll feel it, but also they'll see that's how they should behave. As a leader or a manager, we can't be asking someone to, compose themselves and react in a manner if we're always one of those people that we come in and people can tell straight away if we're in a good mood or not. We need to be modeling the behavior that we want from our teams. We need to be fully aware. And sometimes, of course, as leaders, we're still developing. There's people here that have just become managers, and that's absolutely fine. And what I'd encourage you to do is to speak to other managers in the business or outside of the business to do that. And if you are having a challenging time, is to speak to them, speak to HR, speak to people, but just be mindful of not taking out on your team subconsciously or consciously, and being visible with it. Because of course, yes, you might have had a tough week or a tough evening or whatever, like things happen, it's life. But it's not faking it, it's speaking to the right people. So for me, for example, with my team, I would always be on it, but I know I can go to Sheila, for example, who I report into, and have a bit more of a frank and honest conversation and let my guard down a bit to talk about that. And there's a really good exercise that links to this that you can try, and also to encourage your teams to try, and even do it with them to start off with. And it's called clearing the space. And there's 3 steps to it. It's notice it, name it, neutralize it. And what this does, it's a really good thing to use before a meeting, before a presentation, before the start of your day, like at the end of the day when you're going home, or working from home when you're walking from your lounge to your kitchen. So what happens here is the notice it part. When we are stressed, anxious, worried, we often don't notice it until we're in it. We don't notice we're stressed until we're stressed. We don't notice we're anxious until we're anxious. And there's a little exercise, and you can try this with your teams, and it's harder to do obviously when no one else is on video, but ask them, if you've got a video call, say, right, on the count of 3, I'm going to ask one of you to sing. And you go 1, 2, 3, and you ask no one to sing. It's not real. But what you want to ask them there, or if you're with them at the time, is how did you feel? Like, what did you notice? What things were coming up? And what they'll start to realize is they've got certain triggers, like we all have. It might be a tight chest, the lump in their throat, sweaty palms, like thoughts going on in their head, increased heart rate. All of these things are triggers and signs that we're going into a state that's away from our usual one. And the more we can become aware of that, the more likely we are to catch it and stop ourselves becoming stressed or anxious. We can catch it earlier on. So the notice it part is noticing those triggers, noticing what's going on within your body, and then naming it. So when we notice it, when we start feeling like this, the amygdala part I mentioned in our brain, that's like the alarm system, is going off. We can't think straight. It takes over our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for all our decisions and thoughts. And therefore we can't actually act. And that's why you or your team or other people or friends or family, you might hear things like, oh, I just wasn't myself. Sorry, that just wasn't me. I didn't react in that right way, because it's the primal brain taking over. So what we're doing by naming it is we're bringing the prefrontal cortex back into play, where because we're using words to write something down, it means that we have to think about it. You know, there's 8,000 or 9,000 words in the dictionary, I think, and about 36,000 combinations of emotions. So what's going on up here sometimes isn't very easy to understand. Once we write it down, it's a bit easier to start there. It's why you might often think, I'm so good at giving advice to other people, but I can never take my own. Is because we're so confused with emotions once it's going on in our heads. So writing that down, I feel stressed, for example. Now the neutralizing part is, why do I feel stressed? And you could do this with your teams. Okay, you feel stressed. Why do you feel stressed? What are 2 or 3 things? And again, this comes down to the relationship you have with as a manager and a leader. And what's important here is, and I've spoken to a few people on my podcast about this, and one person talked about it really nicely, was that the management is a bit like chapters. You've got different chapters for different scenarios of your teams. And you're very clear what chapter you're on. Because of course, sometimes as a manager, you need to have a serious conversation about performance or something that's happened. But then other times you need to be there just to listen, just to be open and say, look, none of this conversation here is purely constructive based on what you need. So it's about framing it in the right way, this kind of conversation, before you have it. So I feel stressed. Why do you feel stressed? 2 or 3 things off of here. They'll write those 2 or 3 things down, or they can do this by themselves. And then go, out of all those 3 things, each one, is it in my control? And if so, what could I do, or what am I doing to overcome it? If it's in my control, is it in my control? And if so, what could I do, or what am I doing to overcome it? And what you're doing here, you're kind of building a bit of a mind map for yourself, or your team are as well, to reassure themselves that it's okay. Because, for example, of those 3 things they're worrying about, one might be something they can't control, which you can have an open, honest conversation about, that you might be able to control it. So you might be able to add some support there. And 2 of those things, they might already be doing them. They might not have done them yet, but they're in the process of doing them. And it's kind of telling your brain, when you start to feel anxious or stressed, that, look, I've got it covered. Because, you know, if we take it back to the smoke alarm example, what we often do is we live in it. We don't try and move past it. So it's like going into your kitchen and the smoke alarm's going off, and we don't just stand there and go, oh my God, the house is going to burn down. We switch it off. But when we start feeling like that, stressed or anxious, it's the equivalent of us going into a kitchen and saying, oh my God, the house is going to burn down. It's like the body is there. These emotions are warning you that something is not quite right, or something is happening. If you weren't stressed in that situation, your body or your mind would not be able to cope with it. All those things that happen when you're stressed or you're anxious are actually your body helping you, serve you in that situation. So it's about like looking at them going, do you know what, actually, I'm grateful for this. You know, I talk very openly about this. I used to suffer a lot of anxiety, and I still have anxiety, but I see it as serving me, because whenever I feel anxious is something's not quite right, and it helps me stay on top of the game and focus on things and be very proactive with things. And I think, you know, the more you can start to have these kind of conversations with your team and these kind of exercises, the more comfortable they'll feel and the more self-aware they'll feel of, actually, these things are here to serve me. And I'm more self-aware of what's actually happening to me, what are my triggers, and how do I react to them. So some of these things I've just mentioned there, but, you know, team are able to utilize the emotions and situations. So presenting, building relationships, prospecting, connect and empathize with customers and colleagues more effectively, because, you know, you're more present in the moment. You're not thinking about the past or the future, and coming from a place of optimism and strong self-belief within these emotions, because you're seeing them as serving you. You're not coming from this place of sort of fear and worry all the time, but actually, do you know what? Everything that I'm feeling is here to benefit me. And then the final one is habits and behaviors. So this is probably ones that you can maybe spot the most easier out of the three sometimes. And one of them, the first ones, is that your team are unaware of their strengths and weaknesses. And, you know, I've had people say this to me even since last week, of, you know, just asking, well, I don't quite know what I'm good at, like what my strengths are. I know what everyone knows what they're not good at, but how much do your teams are fully aware, and how much do you make them fully aware of what they're good at? Like reminding them and encouraging that, because I think, you know, we've got this conception that we need to be amazing at everything, and that can't always be the case. But we have 3 or 4 things like superpowers that we're amazing at. And the more your teams can become aware of them, the more they can kind of rely on them and then develop the things around them. But the more you can become aware of them, when you're working on projects and tasks and things and putting people together, you can realize and how you can complement those strengths. And if you are looking to hire people into the team, what you might be missing and what you might be looking for. Because, you know, linked to this, sometimes we have these unconscious biases of what we look for in people and certain strengths, and we end up building a team of everyone being the same. And the problem with that is that, you know, sometimes people clash, but we're also missing out of all these other qualities. So the team are unaware of strengths and weaknesses. Then they don't know what they're good at. They sometimes probably know more what they're not good at. They're often investing time and energy in uncontrollables, so they're worrying about things that they can't do anything about. Whether it's from, you know, the wider business that have put these deadlines in place, or whether it's just something that's happened that no one can control, but they're getting quite pent up about it and worried about it. Their results aren't matching their actions. You might have people in your team that are doing all the right things, but they're just not achieving the results. You know, whether it's in sales and they're doing all the process, or whether it's in other departments and they're doing all these things, but it gets to the point you're thinking, well, this person's in every day, like 8 or 9 hours working, like why are they not hitting their deadlines? And there's a lack of consistency as well. Coming from this place of lack of awareness is that there's no consistency. Someone might be really on it one month. You think, do you know what, they're great. Like when they're great, they're great. But the problem is sometimes they just struggle to show up, or some weeks they just struggle with full stop. They're just not in the zone. So what does this look like from more of a self-awareness point of view? Sorry, I've got an itchy nose. Not the best time for it. So some of you might be familiar with that image on the right-hand side. That's the All Blacks, statistically the most successful sports team of all time. And the All Blacks released this black book a few years ago, which has got all their mantras in. It's a really good read. I think it was in the Times or the Guardian. And one of the things that really resonated with me, and I talk about this a lot and I remind myself a lot of it, is what they do when they win and lose. Now, typically sports teams, when they, like professional sports teams, I'm not talking about your Sunday leagues here, professional sports teams, when they lose on like a big occasion, they'll come in early the next day and analyze it. And when they win, they'll go out and celebrate. The All Blacks actually do that the other way around. So when they win, they'll come in early the next day and analyze it. And when they lose, they'll go out. And their philosophy is it's easier to become more consistent with something you're already doing than changing something you're not. And this isn't me saying never analyze your defeats or things that don't go well. I think you should still do that, but invest as much time in your success as you would do with your failure. So if you haven't had a good month, or your team hasn't had a good month, and you'd have a review, you'd have a meeting or a group meeting because a project you worked on hasn't been successful, then still do that if it's successful. Still do that if your unit has hit a deadline with super pay and it's like over exceeded expectations, or your team has surpassed their performance for the month. Still have that and analyze it. What did you do well? And help your team become more aware of that as well. If they've worked on a project and it's gone well, don't just give them a pat on the back and go, right, okay, on to the next one. Because again, this is about recognition, but also raising that awareness. So when someone has done that, it's getting them to sit down and go, what did you do? What worked for you here? Why was this successful? And often people might be like, oh, it was this and that. And they'll talk about external factors, which sometimes are true, but it's about really drilling in. But what did you do? What difference did you make? What was your thought process going through this? Because the more you can start to get them to think like that, the more they can replicate that, the more they can become consistent with doing that over and over in different situations and becoming more self-aware on it. And by doing that as well and asking them to focus more on the things they can control, they become focused more on controllables, because there's things that they can't control. Is, if they've had a successful project, there's things that are uncontrollable on the outside. They're always going to be there. So when they aren't successful but what are you focusing on here? Are you focusing on something that you can control or you can't? And once they're doing that, once you're starting to get them to become more aware of their strengths and what they are good at, the more authentic they become. Don't feel like I have to be someone else, because they are more aware of, this is me, this is who I am. My team, my manager, my company supports me and is helping me to uncover exactly what makes me great. And therefore I feel more comfortable just being myself, because that's what makes me great. And there's a great talk linked to this. And this is a talk by Simon Sinek that some of you may have heard of, a book called Start With Why. And he talks about the infinite gamer. And in life, there are finite games like sport where there's a winner or a loser, but life in itself is an infinite game. But we often like to play it in a finite way. That's why we have days, weeks, months. That's why we have targets. That's why we have top 10s and all these leaderboards, because we want to see a definitive end to something or beginning. And the problem is, if we play too much like a finite gamer in an infinite way, in an infinite world, we struggle with it. Finite gamers are there to beat someone else. So for example, let's take Microsoft and Apple. Microsoft is a finite gamer. Every time they promote something or talk about something or release something, it's always to beat Apple. They always talk about Apple in their presentations. Apple are an infinite gamer. They're playing because they want to make the world a better place through their technology. They have a greater purpose. And Simon Sinek talked about this. He was in a cab with a guy from Apple, and Microsoft at the time had just released their version of the iPod. This was years ago now. That was better than the iPod at the time. And he turned to him and said, this is so much better than your product. And he was expecting him to react. And he just said, I'm sure it is. He said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, some days are up, some days we're down. And how you've got to look at it is that life is a bit like waves. It's like, ups and downs, it's waves. And the problem is, if you look at it from a finite point of view, where there's definitive end or beginning, when you lose, it feels like, or when you have a bad day, a project doesn't go right, you have a bad month in terms of sales, everything, it feels like the sky is falling. You can't look past that. You're struggling to think about anything else. And when you win, you feel euphoric, you feel amazing. You feel like, oh my God, this is great. And then as soon as that goes, you're like, where did it go? And you start looking for it and worrying about it. And it sort of drags you further down than where you were going to be. But coming at it from more of an infinite mindset is, look, when I'm down, it's like, it's okay. Like, this is just if I've had a bad morning, it doesn't mean it has to be a bad day. I can turn it around this afternoon. If it's been a bad day, it doesn't have to be a bad week. Or if it's been a bad week, it doesn't have to be a bad month. It's just a day. None of these things relate to one another. I can shift this. So you're more likely, when you are sort of at one of those bottom points of your cycle, is to actually think, do you know what, this isn't forever. Now is not forever. And when you're at the top, is thinking back to the first point, what did I do to get here? And also, if I kind of lose that feeling or something slips away, it's not too far away for me to get it back. I'm not searching around like the finite mindset of thinking, oh God, what happened? I thought I'd be happy when I had this month. I thought I'd be really pleased if I hit that number and it's gone. It's just being more mindful of it. So it's a great talk. I've included it in the email I think that Sheila will send out, and encourage you to share it with your teams. And also with these kind of things and some of the exercises, have a call about it, have a Zoom call, send a link to people and then go, let's have a conversation about this. What's people's perception on this? Because again, it's just encouraging people to start shifting their mindset around these things. So again, some of these points I've mentioned already, but how does this benefit you and your team? It's easier for people to buy into them. It's building strong relationships because they know what they're good at. All of the team know each other's strengths. You know what they're not so good at, and so do they, so you can help start developing them. Aware and utilize their natural style. Mindful of how to impact and influence situations because they're focusing on the controllables. They know that these 2 or 3 things I can't do anything about. This is just the parameters I'm working in, but this is what I can do, which leads to them being more productive because they're not wasting time and energy on things that they couldn't control in the first place. So a quick summary around that. I don't know why that one's black rather than blue. It's annoying me. Thoughts and beliefs. Ask questions, not statements to your team. And if your team are coming up with statements or saying things off the cuff, don't challenge them, but just help them reframe that. Thinking about that satisfaction versus perfection for when you are setting expectations for projects and deadlines is what's the minimum, not always, what does it have? Here's what the end goal looks like. Is okay, but what are the milestones in between? Emotions, open conversations, encouraging them to talk about these things and modeling behavior as well around how you want your team to act and behave is how you should be behaving. And habits and behaviors, analyzing success, spending time as much as you would if something didn't go well as to when it does, and encouraging that infinite gamer mindset. One of the things that I shared last week, I'll go through again quickly. I know it was Mental Health Awareness Week a few weeks ago, but I think this is really important. I did I talk a lot about this outside of work, but I went through and did the mental health champion course with Payment Sense. And there's a few things I think it's important because some of these things might come up when you are talking about these things because, they link to, there's deeper rooted things around these thoughts and beliefs and also these emotions that aren't just because of Payment Sense or where they work. It's deep rooted. It's how they've grown up or previous employment. So it's important to be mindful of this when you're talking to them. The big thing, first of all, is empathy, not sympathy. And I think empathy gets a bad rap because people confuse it with sympathy. People think, if I'm just empathetic with someone, they're going to take advantage of it. No, that's sympathetic, and they're not going to take advantage of it. Empathy is listening to them and giving them the space to talk and trying to put yourself in their shoes. Even if you can't, that's okay. And don't always feel like you have to have the answer. Particularly as leaders and managers, we often think when someone on our team comes to us with a problem, we need to fix it straight away. We need to be the go-to. And if we don't, it looks bad on us. They lose that belief in us. That isn't always the case, particularly this topic. You don't always have to have the answer. And it's okay to say that, look, I don't know what we can do right now, but I'm going to find out for you. I'm going to speak to, or would you like to speak to people or HR? Or I'll go around and ask, I'm not going to mention your name and just find out how we can support you on this. Avoid glib advice. So things like cheer up or don't worry about it, as if someone's worried about something, saying that isn't going to help them at all. And then just being open and guiding them to other support avenues. If you feel like, do you know what, actually what you're talking about here, I think it is better to talk to someone. I think it is better to call one of the numbers or to go and speak to HR, to Chloe about this, to people. Be okay with passing them on to someone that you think might be better qualified for this, and they'll appreciate that as well. So thank you everyone for tuning in today. If you've got any questions, feel free to fire them at me. If you're watching this back on repeat, then feel free to email me as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. I don't know if there's any questions yet. No, it doesn't look like there is.
If there's no questions, it would be good from people tuned in just to find out what your main takeaway was, anything that you've sort of learned or made you think about on this call. Thanks, Damien. Glad you enjoyed it. Great. Yeah. The balance between not dwelling on failures and celebrating success was really insightful. Good. Glad, Alex.